To this point, all of the functionality that we've explored with the JavaScript API is having your web page interact with your visualization, telling your visualization what to do. But the JavaScript API also gives you functionality to have your web page react to events that happen on your visualization. And that happens via event listeners. Now, if you're following along, feel free to use your HTML and JavaScript from the previous video, or you can download the zip file from this web page, find Lesson 5 Start, and go ahead and rename that to Tutorial. Open that up in your text editor. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create an event listener that listens for any time someone selects a mark on the embedded visualization. Now I'm going to do that inside of our window.onload function, just because I don't need to create a button for this, so I'm not going to create a new function for it outside of the window.onload. Now adding event listeners happens at the viz level. So we have that viz object. We'll call add event listener, which takes in two arguments. The first is what is the name of the event we're listening to. And there are a handful of different events that you can listen to using the API. Mark selection is one of them. If you'd like to explore all of those options, I recommend reading the documentation. And the second argument to add event listener would be the function that you want to happen when that event happens. In this case, we'll just create a new anonymous function inside of our event listener. And we're going to have that function just do an alert. Marks have been selected. We'll close our function, close the parentheses for add event listener, and give it a semicolon. We'll save that, come to our HTML file, lesson 5 start, and open that up. So nothing's changed about this HTML file, but remember the JavaScript has changed. And what it's done is if I click in any object, that is if I select any mark, I get that marks have been selected option, or alert. I get that marks have been selected alert. There's also a function called remove event listener. Now in order to show how you might use the add event listener in combination with the remove event listener, I'm going to actually put that into a function that's going to toggle on and off that event listener. Let's come back to the bottom of our JavaScript file here, and we will create a function called toggle selection alert. So we want to give it a button in our HTML that turns the selection alert on or off. In order to do that, we need to first know if the listener is on, if the selection alert is on. So we'll create a new global variable here outside of our function. We'll call it listener on, and we'll make sure that we start it as false. Now what are we going to do inside of this function? We're going to first check if the listener is already on. If it is on, we're going to turn it off. And first of all, we're going to make sure we turn that Boolean listener on to false, and then we're going to turn off the event listener. So we'll call viz.remove event listener. Now here's the thing about remove event listener. Now in add event listener, we just created a new function right in here, an anonymous function. But the problem with remove event listener, it needs to know the function that we're turning on and off. So we're actually going to have to come outside of this function here and create a new function called alert func. And it's that same thing we had earlier, alert marks have been selected. And now, instead of an anonymous function, that is, instead of saying function and so on and so forth, we will just say alert func. So turn it off, turn it on if it's not on yet. Or that is, in this case, we're actually turning it off. Else, that is, if the listener is actually off already, then we want to turn it on. So first we'll say listener on equals true. Then we'll say add the event listener. In this case, it's once again pretty similar to what we created earlier, mark selection, but we want to call the alert func. Now, in this case, when you pass in a function here, you don't actually use the open parentheses, close parentheses. So let me remove those. And then we'll close our else bracket. We'll go ahead and close our function bracket. We should be good to go. Hit save here. Now we need to go to that HTML file, lesson 5 start, and make sure that we add a button for that. Now, we're only going to create one button in this video, so I'm just going to keep it in async programming here. Go ahead and grab our solution button, copy paste it. We'll go ahead and call it toggle selection alert, and the function we're going to call is that function we just created, which is called toggle selection alert. We'll save that, run it in Chrome, and we'll notice if we make a selection, we get no alert. That's fine. We'll press our button for toggle selection alert. Now we'll click something and we get the alert. Get that alert again, toggle it a third time, and then it goes away. So alerts are pretty useful for seeing the functionality for event listeners, but they're not really useful for you're not going to actually want to do them in production. So let's create an example where we actually use event listeners for productive use. What I want to do is I want to create a subtitle here underneath JavaScript API tutorial, and I want it to say the name of the sheet that we're looking at. So right now it would say tree map. If we switch to the line chart, I want it to say that. So that's where we're going to have to actually use event listeners to listen for any time we switch a sheet to replace the HTML on my web page with the name of the new sheet. Let's go back to the JavaScript. Actually, let me point something out here in the HTML. You may have noticed this H3, this header called sheet name, has nothing in it. That's actually where we're going to put our sheet name. The way we're going to do that is we're going to come up back to the top. We're not going to create a new function. We're just going to have this happen automatically. And what it's going to do is it's going to listen for a sheet switch event. So that's going to look similar to our mark selection event listener. viz.add event listener. In this case, the event for switching views is called tab switch, and we're going to need to give it a function. Now in this case, we're actually going to give an argument to that anonymous function. It's going to be called event. We can call it what we want, but basically that's what it's doing, is passing in the information for the event. And inside of that function, what we'll do is we want to use JavaScript to find that element that we call sheet name, get element by ID, sheet name. And to that element, we want to change its inner HTML. Again, this is all base JavaScript. It's not part of the API. But the part of the API we will use is we're going to replace that inner HTML with event.getNewSheet. sheet name. So let's talk a little bit about this event argument here. Anytime an event listener is called and you have a function that's reacting to that event listener, the event listener passes on information about the event that happened in the form of an event object. In this case, it's a tab switch event class. So each event class is going to be different. It's going to have different functions inside of it and different information. Mark selection would also have an event. We could have put an event in here in this function. It would have information about the marks. In this case, the tab switch will pass an event object which has specifically a function called getNewSheetName, which will give us the name of the new sheet. So we'll throw that into our inner HTML there. Close our bracket. Be sure to close the parentheses for add event listener function, and we will end that with a semicolon. Now, there's one thing we need to do here before we see if this works. Is we've created this event listener to put the title of the visualization of the sheet inside of that subtitle, but it only happens when we switch sheets. What about when we first create the first sheet? That's never going to call a tab switch event. So what we want to do is we want to do that on first interactive. When the viz first loads, let's get the name of that first sheet. It's going to be similar. Get document.getElement by ID .inner HTML. What's going to go inside there is not event.getNewSheetName because there's no event has happened. What's going to go inside there is biz.getWorkbook, as we've done before, .getActiveSheet, our old friend, and sheets have a function that is getSheetName. Actually, sorry, it's getName. So we'll hit save, and we'll run that in Chrome. Sorry, I need to run my HTML file in Chrome. The viz loads, and instantly it tells us we're looking at a tree map. Now we'll click line chart, and that HTML follows our specifications to switch to the name of the sheet. Same thing will happen if we switch to a dashboard. So that's event listeners in a nutshell. Hopefully you can see that it's really not too complicated to set them up. But event listeners can do a variety of things, and if you're interested in doing that kind of thing with the JavaScript API, I recommend looking at the documentation specifically for event listeners and seeing all of the things, all the different types of events and all of the things you can do with event listeners. The next video we'll have is going to cover advanced filtering. We previously only covered categorical filtering, but we're going to do things like range filtering and date filtering and that kind of thing. So if you're interested in that, I'll see you on the next video.